Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to our lunch and lecture. The National Archives has been the storehouse of our nation's history and is within the most auspicious year that we seek to touch the lives of varied audience throughout our heightened outreach activities. The theme, 50 years come and gone. How you feel is rooted in a local calypso, but it begs individuals to evaluate the progress of the country has made and to consider their feelings and contribution towards its development. This 50th Jubilee is a time for reflection. We must all reflect on the various aspects of our country development. With this in mind, the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago is bent on facilitating reflections by our citizens of all ages. We will also use this important event to reach the younger audience with the distribution of coloring and activity books at various primary schools across the nation. For this year, we are proud to work and collaborate with a number of organizations, like, for example, the University of West Indies History Department. A stint of commemorative lecture and exhibit will commemorate in one-day lecture series and a grand exhibition. This lecture will reflect on many aspects of our culture, society, and economy. Our exhibition will feature pivotal records and documents which tell of our nation's independence. We look forward to open minds and making our recorded history accessible throughout this, our 50th Jubilee year. Thank you.
Pleasant good morning to our Permanent Secretary, Acting, Ms. Desra Bascom, our Acting Deputy Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Arts and Multiculturalism, Mr. Vel Lewis, Ms. Belfon, heads of department, members of the Ministry and of Archives, to one and all gathered here this morning for this important exercise. Because I would need to commend the archives for this exercise, which is so important in looking at the history of Carnival 50 years to now. Through the acquisition and preservation and cataloging of our nations and the government's records, the archives has played and continues to play an important role in preserving the memory of our people. This morning's lecture, I must say, ought to serve in awakening our thoughts, our interests, and our ideas in terms of the value of Carnival and the value of Calypso, the value of Steel Band in our 50 years of independence. But I think that it is important that we recognize the role that all of these things have played in developing that unique identity that is Trinidad and Tobago. We are now moving into the observance of 50 years of independence. And as Ms. Belfon asked, how do we feel about it? And that journey of 50 years has traversed us through so much. Some that may be pleasant for us to remember, and some that may not be as pleasant. But all being said, it is a journey that we need to reflect on. It's a journey that we need to study carefully as we embark on the next 50 years, so that we could somehow avoid the errors that were made in the past. And as we move into the next 50 years, we utilize the strengths, the experiences, and the knowledge that we acquired during that past 50 years as a springboard into the future. And this is the importance of archives. They are part of our memory. They have played a critical role. And I was very pleased to hear Ms. Belfon say that this reflection does not stop with a reflection of Carnival and the arts. And that this reflection is going to look at different aspects of our nation's culture, history, and experience. And that also it would take the form of an outreach, moving into different sectors and engaging different sectors of our society, more so our students, our university, and one and all who ought to have some kind of interest in our historical experience, which is going to guide us into the future. As we begin these functions, we play the national anthem. What does it mean to us? Is it merely ritual? Is it merely a formality? Or does it tell us that we all belong to a nation and that therefore we should use our national identity as a means of adding value to our lives and value to the lives of those who are to come after us? I believe that we are in a search for value, a value that archives has played and needs to play such an important role in ensuring that that value is preserved and that that value is disseminated to our population in the interest of national development. It is also a search for excellence. And as I was taking a brief look at the display out there, I saw some of that excellence being portrayed in our artists who have served this nation for so many years. So once again, I would like to congratulate Archives, Ms. Belfon and her team, and all others who may have contributed to this exercise. I think it's a beautiful idea, and I would guarantee that the ministry will do everything possible to ensure that it could be as successful as possible in this 50th year of independence as we forge that identity and as we strive to really and truly become a nation with some kind of common objective, common purpose, and that common striving for the development of our people. I thank you very much.
Going back to answer the question, 50 years into independence, how you feel? Well, I feel we need to know a little bit more of ourselves to feel some way about ourselves first, right? Because what we usually encounter when we look at mass now, this is moving very quickly, are these images, which have validity in their own right? But it's not the only thing. And these images are sponsored by and projected by power base, a media base, right? Sorry. Is there a way to slow this thing down? Or, apart from the contemporary mass, we also face or engage with traditional mass or children's carnival, right? And that's what we know and that's what we see every carnival, especially in the era of the carnival magazines, right? What we don't know is this. And the we, well, again, most of you may know it, but by and large, the audience that is out there and the younger ones really have no idea of this aspect of our masquerade. Right? What I wanted to do as well is articulate a bit how the themes moved through the last 50 years, right? The notion of a national festival, or as mass being as a national entity close to our heart, is I don't want to say a recent one, but it wasn't always there, right? You have in 1969 Andrew Carr writing, talking about in the 1900s how carnival was looked upon and frowned upon, right, as something to be turned away from. What you have in the years before independence, at the dawn of independence, is the festival being accepted as our own art form. And that is significant because it means that you now have artists producing with the idea that they are producing something of themselves, with the notion that they are producing something that represents the best of themselves, a notion that is both validated by the media and official thought, right? So you have the themes now. Even if they don't do it directly, there's always this subconscious that we are producing a Trinidadian thing, right? And that little nuance is very interesting and important when we look at the mass. You have in the years before mass, these are the bands of the years, right? You have themes like Imperial Rome, Norse gods and Vikings, back to Africa, Atlantis, Crees of Canada, Ye Saga of Merry England, Byzantine Empire, right? In 1962, you have Somewhere in the Guinea. What I see is in those years, you see a notion of larger than self, a notion of structure, empire, but it all links to identity, right? It all links to trying to investigate oneself in the world, right? And attaching oneself to power. What happened after independence, very interesting for me, is that the theme started to shift a bit, right? So you have, and it's actually better in the next slide, but you have themes like Wonders of the Boca Reef. You have themes like El Dorado, Kaleidoscope, We Kind of People, right? In the 70s in particular, which really explored, let me show it here, right? It's clearing the people's choice, which really explored our own landscape and images of our landscape. And one of the major designers inside that was Irvin McWilliams, right? So just looking at his themes, Wonders of Buko, a Nancy story, Seasons and Greetings, which was a mask that tried to bring up the images of our seasons. So like Easter, kite season, that kind of thing. Know Your Country. The Rains Came. What you have after that are what I feel are themes that more explore a conceptual idea of who we are. So now you have the advent of Minchell and Barclay, right? And the last major designer I would throw in the mix, but it's not really a designer, is a archetype, I suppose, is Tribe, right? And I'm saying Tribe not to say a designer, but to say a theme, a span, a breadth of mass that would incorporate Poison and all those others, right? But they really projected into fantasy, and to me, pushing the limits in terms of commerce, pushing the limits in terms of the band size, pushing the limits in what we could do inside of the mass. Not necessarily in art, right? So the presentation is really supposed to be an engagement with some of the images that I have encountered in my research. 1960. What I like about this is I want to say the costumery, but the um, total articulation of the body in it. Polar Ice was the name of this band. And if you could see this one. Harold Saldina, Mexico. Silver Stars, Faces of Conquest. Stephen Leong, Japan, Land of the Kabuki. Bailey's Bright Africa. An individual from Tears of the Indies. Beauty in Perpetuity. George Bailey. Fancy Bats and Clowns. One of the things I also wanted to bring up is the shift in materials, the shift in how we produce mass. I don't know if you could see this image properly, but this is the wire bending process, right? Yeah. Again, a lot of you are familiar with it. I was hoping to impress those who were not. Right. So this is the wire bending process, the structure, the paper mache overlay, which look like this on the road, right? When you show this in class, they don't believe that a man's head suddenly becomes a gigantic bunny, right? This range of imagery is something that we are not acquainted with. Our younger ones, those who I encounter, right? A mass camp from the 1970s. Everyone is making mass, everyone is bending wire. Cito Velasquez, 3,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The words, the winners are not the important thing. What I wanted to show was the dinosaur in the back. And if you can see the legs. I mean, some really fantastic stuff. Some really fantastic stuff. This is the catalog of imagery that we have. Right? He started moving to Irvin McWilliams' mass. One of the things about Irvin McWilliams' mass is that it may look rudimentary, but he really delved into local themes. And part of his masquerade was impact on a large scale, right? So this is, where's the name? Boanansi, right? Our famous recipes. I think this is cascadeur and something. This was stuffed egg. You understand? the breadth of imagery. I can't remember what this was. Know Your Country. Pui Season. Arima Dial. Yeah, I'm glad some of you are impressed. To go back a bit, right? Point up here, oil rigs, right? Then you move into some of Stephen Lee Hyung's work. Again, mean, something like that is right. Peter Minshall's The Hummingbird. Right. In a conversation with him through doing my thesis, one of the things he said is that he sat and he sewed every sequin on that hummingbird, right? And people were asking him, well, why? You know, we could stick it, you know, but the integrity of it was important to him. The integrity of it in terms that he was doing something, again, that projected what he felt we were about. So it wasn't enough to simply stick it on and make it something transient, right? But to put his all into it, as with the wire benders and all of those before. From Dance Macabre. From Papillon. Sorry, Pico Plat. There's a recent one, Yemanja is the queen of the bands. Right? And we kind of come full circle back to what we know. But the idea behind it is that there is a host of images out there, right? This is not even tickling the surface of it. There's a host of images out there that we don't know, that needs to come to the surface in some way. And in looking at 50 years of independence, I think we need to look at first what we have done. I think that we need to look at mass as something that has interrogated us and tried to interrogate our notions of identity, right? But we have not done so in return to interrogate the mass and simply to see what it has said.
I would like to thank Mrs. Rebecca Fortune for inviting me to participate in this National Archives Carnival lecture, when the nation is about to celebrate and meditate on 50 years of independence. My task is to outline some of the major features of these 5 decades as they have been viewed through the eyes of Calypsonians. I will consider 2 major features of independence. First of all, the freedom it has brought from certain aspects of colonial overlordship. I say from certain aspects because it certainly hasn't freed us from all of the aspects. And secondly, the responsibility independence has imposed on both the leaders and the people to shape a new nation. And I'm saying that Calypsonians have had a lot to say on both aspects. Independence in 1962 came for Jamaica early in August, I think it's the 6th, I stand to be corrected, and in Trinidad and Tobago at the end of the month, August the 31st. But it came in the wake of the collapse of the West Indian Federation, 1958 roughly to 61. Independence came as something of a shock, both because the people of the region were still mourning the death of a federation that had been the result of so much debate, negotiation, and indeed expense of both money and spirit, intelligence, emotion. And because it had been the belief that Great Britain would never grant independence to any of the islands separately, but would instead consider bestowing dominion status, a sort of partial interim self-rule, on the federated island micro-states after proper testing of the system of federation. So federation was like a test that we needed to pass before we would get anywhere else. Lord Larrow's no federation. Lord Larrow was, I think, a Tobagonian who went across to Jamaica with the West India Regiment and stayed there well into the 70s and 80s, sang things like Irie Carnival and that sort of thing. And kind of blended, one of the people who blended the calypso narrative style with the Jamaican reggae rocksteady beat. But he sang No Federation, no. And in it he dramatized the fervor and excitement generated by in Jamaica by Alexander Bustamante's referendum campaign against the Federation. While Sparrow's Federation in 1961 expressed the anger of Trinidad and Tobago and perhaps the other federated islands at what was perceived as Jamaica's betrayal of the regional movement towards independence. Independence was at their door. Why they didn't speak before? This ain't no time to say you ain't federating no more. So up to 61, we didn't really expect that you would get independence just like that. And we were expressing regret at the breakup of the Federation. Sparrow also predicted, however, that TNT would get independence, though he felt that the regional independence via a united federation would be more meaningful than the separate independence of any single state. Federation boils down to simply this. It's dog eat dog and survival of the fittest. Everybody fighting for independence, singularly. Trinidad, for instance. We're going to get it too, but don't bother. But I find we should all be together, not separated as we are because of Jamaica. And then Sparrow said in one line, we failed miserably. That was his conclusion at this point. Yet 1 year later, though he was joining fellow Calypsonians, Lord Bryner, Nap Hepburn, Hawk, Pretender, Chiankai Shek, and I think Christo, in celebrating the birth of the new nation. Independence was a moment of joy and hope because he said, colonialism gone, our nation is born. That's in model nation. Slogans and watchwords like discipline, tolerance, production, and the national motto, together we aspire, together we achieve, which became together we conspire, together we deceive, or together we perspire, together we conceive, all kinds of, that's the carnival spirit, you see. You play on the thing. Those watchwords were repeated throughout the independence calypsos in that competition in 1962. The individualism, disunity, and inter-ethnic and inter-class contestation that Dr. Williams, at that very moment of independence, caustically condemned as ingrained national traits, were either ignored or laid aside as matters to be addressed later on. For the moment, Calypsonians, quite correctly I think, focused on the perceived positives: the human wealth, the potential richness in cultures of the multi-ethnic state, the relatively small, according to them, conflicts created by race, color, and class differences. That's the essence of what Bryner, who won the competition, was saying. This sidelining of the negative side of social existence did not mean that Calypsonians or the public whose voice they were unaware or in absolute denial of the real challenges, many of which, such as acrimonious racist quarreling, you'd had a lot of that, a few startling incidents of racially motivated violence in the 1961 elections, we'd had that too, steadily growing crime in the urban margins, unrest in organized labor, juvenile delinquency, prostitution, and other things like that. These had been manifesting themselves in the 17 years since 1945, and one may argue even before that. Unemployment, rife in the 1930s, and only artificially reduced during the years of the American occupation, had resurfaced as a dangerous and challenging hardy perennial. Trinidad and Tobago had remained a haven for immigrants from the southern Caribbean islands. The Federation indeed had disintegrated partially because of the fear of such free movement of workers into already saturated labor markets of the barely coping larger islands. Both Jamaica and Trinidad felt that federation, if it meant free movement of the population of the federated islands, would just place a strain on a labor market which was already under strain. Calypsonians knew all of this. They had sung quite a number of calypsos about this. They were aware of all issues long before 1962. Sparrow's Gunslingers, 1959, had 3 years or so before independence, indicated the transition from the razor and cutlass. I noticed we've made a movement back to the gun as the weapon of choice among the nation's gangster element. And I brought some CDs. I don't know if you can play them or any of them, but I have Gunslingers. I'll talk about it if you can't. More than this calypso had highlighted the emergence of a new type of criminal, very much present with us today, I should say. And that is not the gunslinger, but the grassroots entrepreneur who was more interested in selling firearms. And even the more conventional, he says, weapons like sledgehammers, hatchets, even saw. He said he's selling from cannon to razor blade. Selling everything. But he was more interested in selling them than in using them himself. Notice a new man. He was a shapeshifter, a mediator between the local and metropolitan suppliers of his weapons and the delusionary local criminals who constituted his main but as yet unexploited market. The new man. And he crosses classes. This for me is very important. If you don't believe me, wait and you will see. They're coming down by the crates from quite in the States. I have my contact where they come from. I have my contact with the custom. I have more contact than I could tell. Now I want to contact a place to sell. That's how some of the Muslim guns came in, by crates from the States. Years later, in Gunslinger Sparrow's protagonist advertises his presence on the scene. To whom it may concern, he's advertising, I'm here. Come to me and buy and don't be afraid of selling from cannon to razor blade. The linkages that he boasts of with all the necessary stakeholders, those abroad, the customs right here, suggests a level of corruption that already existed before independence. We had to be a very corrupt society for this fellow to operate. It suggests, too, that he, as I said, was moving through classes. And he is the forerunner of, say, David Rudder's even more menacing denizens in Another Day in Paradise, 1995. They who enjoy connections with the cream of the local bourgeoisie. Because when a gorgon shoot another gorgon, the doctor's job is to stitch up the organ. The lawyer's job is to keep him out of jail. Now he back on the street. Terror in your tail. The gorgons are interlinked with those who used to be the pillars of respectability before, the doctors and the lawyers. And that is the emergence of a whole new process within our 50 years of independence. We are developed, you may say, in 35 years of independence at that point in time. So in 1962, we had the world that the colonials had left us, a world they had hastily abandoned while retaining a tight hold, of course, on the economy. We also had a cluster of negative self-destructive tendencies that Dr. Williams recognized and the Calypsonians recognized. Tendencies that, whether we acknowledged them or denied them, would undermine our efforts at nation building. Dr. Williams hoped and had preached since 1946 in education in the British West Indies that a restructured and expanded program of education would help combat and maybe even eliminate some of the problems he had inherited. I have recently, that's last year, completed an essay that is entitled Calypso, Education and Community in Trinidad from the 1940s to 2011, in which I try to outline the fascinating narrative of this nation's struggle throughout the 5 decades, Dr. Eric Williams's regimes, and the 30 years since his death. The nation struggled to transform the negative side of its image via education. This was the major task in the post-independence mission of nation building. We had these negatives, they were there. They were there long ago, and we had to create a new nation. How do you create a new nation if we still preserve those negatives? And then how do you get rid of the negatives? How do you transform those negatives? And Dr. Williams believed that education, radical changes in education, would first of all help us to create new jobs or new abilities to do maybe old jobs. Would also help us to think about ourselves, to understand our situation, and to prevent some of the pitfalls that were yawning in front of us. And I think if you really read Education in the British West Indies, you would see that education in the British West Indies, not only in Trinidad, but in all the West Indies, really was based and grew on the blueprint almost that Dr. Williams had designed since 1946-47, when he was not in politics, but at the West Indian Commission. But the improved education that Dr. Williams advocated, and to a great extent, I would say, delivered, encountered what I call the curriculum of the streets. I mean, in other words, there was a counter-education constantly taking place there that was perhaps more attractive to the youth on the street. And the outlines of those syllabuses on the street, one might scrutinize in Sparrow's Bajon Calypsos, a calypso like The Rebel, 1966, tells you the story of a young boy who is brought up in opposition to the Bajons in his area. They push him around, tap him. They don't function as role models at all. Or if they are role models, they are negative role models. He is dead set on not becoming like them, but while he is dead set on not becoming like them, he's becoming like them. Because his only way of fighting back is to dream of when they will get old. And he will then be the bad John. And he will, push them around when they need some kind of love or attention. What I'm saying is the environment there did not breed love, communication. The youths were growing up in that kind of environment. The Rebel, 66. Shantytown people, also I think 66. I think when Sparrow sang it, they booed him and walked out of the tent, a number of people. But Shantytown people gave us an insight into some of our peri-urban communities, how people actually behave towards each other. And it told us that our notion of community, the communities that people at Calypsonians seem to long for in nostalgic calypsos now, bring back the old time days. And there are a number of them, which paint a picture of communities which probably did exist, but I suspect are a romanticized version of what really did exist, of the conflicts that were in these communities ready to explode. And there were many other calypsos of this ilk, not just Sparrow, but quite a few others. A calypsonian called Leveler in 1966 sang a very important calypso, How to Curb Delinquency. And he begins by telling us that there was gelignite and bombs and so on going off in the hills every night. And that the people who were setting these bombs off had been approached and spoken to by preachers, by social workers, by police maybe, but it didn't make any difference. So there was, by the mid-60s, so that's only 4 years after independence, the recognition that something new had begun to emerge on our social scene. And that was bombs, a new dimension of violence, and people with a mentality that had been bred out of things like the movies. You get constant references to movies, cowboy movies, crime movies, and that sort of thing, even at that point. So we had a task to perform in nation building. How to Curb Delinquency outlines a comprehensive list of deficiencies in Trinidad and Tobago society. 4 years after independence, Leveler was noting, like Blakey in a calypso called The Doctor Ent There, the existence of these negatives, that I call them, gang warfare taking place, unemployment, an exploding population, disintegrating communities. And he tried to make a few suggestions on how some of these things might be curbed. Prowler, Sparrow would sing Education in 1967, reinforcing the Williams message. Prowler sang Build More Trade Schools in 1969, again reinforcing the Williams message. All of that was in Williams 46. Chalk Dust would then in 1970 sing Massa Day Must Done, implying obviously that Massa Day was still very much with us, that we had independence but we hadn't moved out of colonial tendencies. So we were still in the era of being before independence, and all sorts of features. And he said these features were being ironically maintained by the very government that had sworn to get rid of them. And the government know, but they are discriminating also. He's talking about difficulty to get jobs, particularly for young women. He says to get jobs, our girls have to sin, while in some bars and clubs you see one race and same skin. And the government know, but they discriminating also. So you have there a critique of leadership emerging, a critique of the people, a critique of the situation, and also a critique of leadership. And Massa Day Done was one of, Massa Day Must Done was in fact a critique of Eric Williams' speech in 61, Massa Day Done. So you have the Calypsonian now directly criticizing the leader of the country, the difference between what he was saying, what he was planning, and what was in fact taking place. Black Stalin would sing National Reconstruction in 1971 after the Black Power insurrection. And he said that the first thing that you have to ask yourself if we are going to reconstruct the nation is what caused it to break down in the first place. Valentino, of course, we didn't want no revolution, speaks about the need to do justice to the people, otherwise history is going to punish you worse than you punish we. So by 1970 and the early 70s, there was a strong feeling that independence had, for all sorts of reasons, including that of defective leadership, failed. It's not necessarily true, but the feeling was there. Against such pessimism may be measured, going back to the mid-50s, Sniper's Portrait of Trinidad, a calypso that came to be regarded as being almost a second national anthem. This calypso, not penned by Sniper, but by Penman, but it was presented and delivered by Sniper with great sincerity. This calypso came to be regarded as I said, a second national anthem. It stressed the material and human positives in the nation, which Sniper declared was small but overwhelming in worth. They're very, very powerful words. They always move me when I hear them. Small but overwhelming in worth, even as he affirmed the carnival as being the greatest frolic on earth. Lord Baker, too, would sing God Bless Our Nation around 1966, a calypso that was full of fervor and hope for this wonderland of calypso, this wonderland of steel band where I was born. That's in Baker's chorus. So by the mid-60s, we could say two trends were observable. A trend of stark realism tinged with a feeling of failure, feeling of bitterness even. A trend, on the other hand, of optimistic affirmation that simply refused to be fazed by the emerging and grim reality. Both trends have continued. Though I'd estimate that in terms of calypso, pessimistic realism has greatly outweighed optimistic affirmation. I may be wrong about that too. Stalin indeed would by 73 sing about repainting the portrait of Trinidad, so that if Sniper was outlining the positives by painting the portrait of Trinidad, Stalin would say, we have to repaint the portrait of Trinidad. So you have what one might term deconstructive calypsos. Calypsos that are taking beliefs, ideologies, hopes, ways of seeing things and breaking them down, seeing through them and presenting the other side of them, repainting the portrait of Trinidad. Valentino's entire output, one may say, has been a most devastating critique of what that Calypsonian views as national qualities. He would speak of our forgetting of history, a very important theme since we're in the archives and we're told that the archives is about memory. Valentino says, but Trini have this funny way of forgetting. The things that happened in the 70s, like, they don't mean nothing, you know, and he is meditating on this ability to forget. Gypsy has a very good calypso on that theme as well. Our loss of the memory of what happened maybe 10 years ago, maybe last year. These days I would say last week. Yeah, because you see, we are now like in a national movie house. I've been saying that it's like we're looking at a split screen television with about 10 to 20 movies taking place simultaneously. And these movies are moving so fast that we don't know which one we're looking at any given moment.